at the University of California, San Diego, and I'm very happy to host this seminar with COMEXI, the Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales, and Roberta Layuz, who is member of the board of COMEXI. She will join us. Thank you, Ambassador Roberta Layuz, for joining us. We have a wonderful panel. We're 4 days away of the election, and we know that Latino vote is key. So we have a wonderful panel, and but before Roberta will introduce you the panel, let me give the floor to Mariana Lopez, so she could explain you how to listen to this in either in English or in Spanish. We'll be speaking in English, but if you want to listen, si quieren ustedes escuchar esto en español, you can listen it. Mariana. Mariana, please, could you give the explanation, please?
Thank you, Rafael. Good morning, everyone. We will be offering simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish during this meeting. If you wish to hear the speakers in English or Spanish, please click the interpretation button at the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen. You'll see a globe icon that will appear right after these instructions. If you're joining us via the Zoom smartphone app, select your language by clicking More or the 3 dots in the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen. Select Language Interpretation, then choose English or Spanish and click Done. If you wish to hear only the interpreter and not the original speaker, be sure to click Mute Original Audio. We kindly suggest that you choose the language of your preference. Do not stay in the default. Muy buenos días a todos. Estaremos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea al inglés y español durante esta reunión. Si desea escuchar la interpretación al inglés o español, haga clic en el botón de interpretación en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla Zoom. Verá un icono en forma de globo terráqueo que se encenderá después de estas instrucciones. Si nos acompaña por medio de la aplicación Zoom para teléfono inteligente, seleccione su idioma haciendo clic en donde dice Más o en los 3 puntos en la esquina inferior derecha de su pantalla. Seleccione Interpretación del idioma, elija español o inglés y haga clic en donde dice Listo. Si desea escuchar solo al intérprete y no al presentador, asegúrese de hacer clic en donde dice Silenciar el audio original. Le sugerimos elegir el idioma de su preferencia. No se quede en la posición predeterminada. Back to you, Rafael. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. So I will give the floor to Roberta Layuz so she could introduce our panelists. We have a wonderful panel, the best people to analyze Latinos voting this next November 5th. So Roberta, please, could you introduce our panelists?
Good morning to everybody in San Diego and Mexico City. Good afternoon to those of us at Eastern Time. It is really an incredible opportunity to share with the extraordinary panel that we have this morning the discussion about the importance of the Latino voters, especially since the last 2 days. The Latino voters have been on the forefront of political discussion since the event in New York City where Puerto Rican was mentioned in a very derogatory way, and there's been a strong reaction all along. So the Latino vote has come to the forefront. Let me tell you how lucky we are to have this morning Cindy Benavides, who is president and CEO of Latino Victory, an organization especially dedicated to build political power of the Latino level. And she has been recognized as a national leader in the United States for civil rights and is profoundly committed to the task of giving a voice to different marginal populations. She has been a part of LULAC and many other organizations that represent Latinos. She's studied at American University and also has been part of important organizations and advised as advisor. Clarisa Martinez de Castro, also a very well-known activist. She is part of Iniciativa del Voto Latino, Initiative for Latin Votes, Unidos USA, a national organization to promote civil rights and defense of rights of Latinos, the biggest one in the United States. And she's a graduate of Occidental College and Harvard University. David Ayllón, public intellectual, very well known for both the US and Mexico audience for his important work on issues relating to the Mexican American community. He is now a senior fellow for the study of Los Angeles at Loyola Marymount University. He's associated with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and numerous academic institutions, both in Mexico and the United States. He studied at Princeton, Stanford, and El Colegio de Mexico. I salute, also my alma mater. We also have a very important member of the academic community, but also a political activist, Roberto Suro, emeritus at the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism of the Saul Price School of Public Policy of the University of Southern California. He has been very active in different organizations and also has written extensively on migratory politics and Latin politics for the New York Times Sunday Review and other publications. We are extremely lucky to have such an important panel this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberta. So let's go right to it. And let me remind everybody who want this to be very interactive. So there's a Q&A button back down there. Please use it. Send your questions to our panelists, and we'll be very happy to do this as interactive as possible. Again, send your questions, please. So let's start by the title of this webinar. Are Latinos giving it back, the White House, to Donald Trump? Let me start with you, Clarissa, and let me say that I'm very proud of you, Clarissa. I'm very proud of you, Cindy. I mean, you're doing beautiful things for Latinos. Your leadership is very important to the U.S. and to Latin America and to the world. So thank you, Clarissa, for being with us, and yours is the floor.
Thank you, Rafael, and I am equally pleased to be part of this conversation with all of you. Hopefully I'll pick up a couple of things from everyone here as we head into the analysis of next week. So I think that the shortest answer is está por verse, right? So first of all, if Latinos were the only voters voting in this election, the results would be clear and we would be going to bed early, right? The reality is that still to this day, the majority of Latinos across every state, with the exception perhaps of Florida, are going to end up on the Democratic column if the trends we're seeing hold. Now, because it's a very, very tight election, the levels at which that happens matter a great deal, right? A couple of points in one direction or another can change the outcome in a particular state. And so while many folks are looking at places like Nevada and Arizona as the places where Latinos are going to be decisive, the reality is that given razor-thin margins, if we look at the other 5 battleground states, the 7 everybody's talking about, so in addition to Arizona and Nevada, talking about Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, in all of those places in 2020, Latinos cast ballots in numbers greater than the margin of the presidential victory in those states. So you can see how tight this is. So there is a potential that if the margins on the Democratic side go down, then by default, that benefits Trump. So in some ways, you could say the answer to your question is yes, Latinos are going to play a role either way on whoever wins, having been part of that. But we have long said that Latinos are part of the winning equation, and that is true not only at the national level, we also are looking at the battle for control of Congress. And that's one of the reasons we continue to push the parties and candidates that they need to reach out to, engage with, and win the support of these voters and not take them for granted. And I'm sure we're going to talk about what those levels of outreach have been and whether the parties have done a good job or not in trying to get these voters' support. Back to you, Rafael.
Thank you, Clarissa. David Ayon. David, I mean, what is the percentage of Latinos that will expect to be voting for Mr. Trump?
It varies in terms of the polls that we've seen. He has improved. There's no question but that Trump did better in 2016 against Hillary Clinton than Romney did against Obama in the election before that. Trump improved again in 2020, and he was on course to improve again. In fact, so far on course against Joe Biden, President Biden, that the Latino vote was essentially split between Biden and Trump last June. So it has become a question of how much of that erosion or that drift towards Trump could Kamala Harris achieve? And I think there are limits to how much she can achieve, and we could go into that. But she has recovered a great deal. Now it stands approximately 60-40. There are different polls with different estimates on that, perhaps not quite 60% for Kamala Harris, but I would expect that she will reach that. Her ticket will reach that. And even if Trump reaches 40, which he hasn't in the past, he will not have exceeded what Republican candidates have received in previous elections, especially 2004, George W. Bush, or 1984, Ronald Reagan, or even 1972 with Richard Nixon. So he may crack. If Trump cracks 40%, I don't think that wins him the election, but it is a significant advance for him over his previous two contests.
Thank you, David. What is your take, Roberto? You were in the Pew Center. You know about polls. You've been looking at the elections. Is this time different? Why are so many Latinos going for Trump, shooting for Trump, for Republicans, Roberto?
Well, there are a number of factors. I mean, one very large one is the broader realignment of working class, lower middle class voters, starting with whites initially in the 20 teens, notably in both of the previous Trump elections. And according to the polls, the movement away from the Democratic Party by working class voters has extended further to non-white voters, Latinos and Blacks as well. So part of it is the appeal of economic populism, the very profound effects on working class families of the pandemic and the inflation that followed seem to have given Trump an opening to not only hold what he had, but to increase it somewhat on the basis of what has been this kind of core appeal. There's the additional factor in this election of another trend greatly accentuated, which is a gender split, which we've all read about, in which all the polls very decisively show that Harris has a very significant advantage among female voters, and Trump is making gains among male voters that previously were Democratic constituencies, and among them Latino males as well. And the gender gap between Latino males and females in the Trump era has been notable, and it seems to be increasing. And finally, I would add, it appears, well, we know, it's beyond appearance, that what used to be thought of as a kind of a fear factor, that a great deal of xenophobic rhetoric anti-immigrant proposals would animate Latino voters to go in the opposite direction. That was a long-standing assumption through the whole later part of the 20th century and up until the first Trump election. But between the two Trump elections, we've seen that was not the case. And the assumption is that the same will hold this time. You can't assume that because he has increased the vitriol and the extremism of the policy proposals, that somehow is going to create a negative reaction among Latino voters, at least based on past performances. If this electorate overall behaves the way it did in 2016 and 2020, you wouldn't expect necessarily to see that element produce a noble reaction.
Thank you, Roberto. Let me go with you, Cindy. You're in Virginia. You're reaching out the vote of Latinas. And so what is your take of this? You're seeing more interest for Republicans, but what is your take? Do you think that why Kamala hasn't been that much appealing for Latinos? Give us your sense from where you are, and tell us a little bit about your daily work, Cindy. You're out there, I believe, as Clarissa, trying to get out the vote. So tell us a little bit, give us a sense of what you're doing. And let me remind everybody, I mean, we have this Q&A button. Please send us your questions. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So we'll be pleased, Roberta and I, to read your questions to the panelists. And again, send us your questions. Cindy, to you.
Gracias, Rafael. Bueno, primero que nada, muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much to Ambassador Roberta for that introduction, and Rafael, to you for extending this invitation. I do want to give a shout out to mi amiga del alma, Lenny Gonzalez, who I know is joining, and is the reason why I actually got into politics. So Lenny, you are part of my journey. You know, as I think of your question, Rafael, I think you actually have it wrong. So, you know, what we're seeing, we just did a poll and we released it in mid-October. But what we're seeing, and really going to Roberto's point, is that 73% of the people that did our poll support and plan to vote for Vice President Harris. Specifically important to note is that there was a significant amount of Latinas, over 60%, who plan to vote for the vice president. We also saw that young voters are really have a high level of enthusiasm since she's joined the race. And then I would also note, and I don't think we always talk about this, but Spanish dominant voters in particular have like the biggest gap between English dominant Latino voters and Spanish dominant voters in terms of their support for the vice president, again, upwards of 76%. And so, Rafael, as you know, as someone who comes from field, and what that means is that I love to be on the doors, I love to phone bank, I love to talk to voters directly, and actually heading out to Pennsylvania right after this to knock on some doors for our candidates. You know, we hear a little bit of everything, and I can tell you, overwhelming, the conversations that I've had at the door is that people are enthusiastic. I've knocked on doors where people have voted early and are actually volunteering for the first time in this election, whether it's as poll watchers or to help the campaign to get more Latino voters out. And then I would say to Rafael that people forget that Latinos are persuasion voters. You have to give us a reason to vote. And when we look at the issues and what matters to our community, it's the economy. And, you know, I almost want to say like, it's the economy, stupid, but I feel like my parents would like jalarme la oreja for saying a bad word, because we continue to see that the economy, that jobs and inflation continues to be the top issue for Latinos, for working families, and what they envision for their own community. And then I would also just highlight that reproductive rights is polling really high. Nearly 65% of Latino voters say that protecting reproductive rights is a key issue influencing their vote. We know that this is true for Latinos overall, and especially for Latinas. And then I would say another issue that often we don't talk about is climate change. Latino voters are increasingly concerned about the climate crisis. And we know from being in Arizona and Florida and California, Rafael, where there have been massive wildfires, where we've had record heat in these last few weeks, that Latino families face severe climate impact, and that we are directly impacted not only in our health, but where we live. And so protecting our families from climate change is really important. And from the poll, we know that over 70% of Latino voters support stronger climate action policies. And then I would just add, Rafael, that what do I do day to day? We have 3 organizations, a C3, a C4, and a super PAC. But what I enjoy the most is recruiting more Latinos to run for office. People don't know that in America, there's 500,000 positions, of which Latinos only occupy a little bit over 7,000, or less than 2%. When, Rafael, we make up nearly 20% of the total US population. So when you're talking about representation, yes, absolutely turning out to vote. We have 36.4 million eligible Latino voters in this election, of which we expect over 17 million to vote, with a massive opportunity for the future. But I would say also that, like casting our ballot and also deciding to run for office will be important. And lastly, I just wanted to loop back to something that Clarissa mentioned, and that is that in this election, it will be about the margins. We saw this in North Carolina. We saw this in Georgia. We saw it in Arizona. And Georgia and Arizona, those elections were won by 10,000 votes. And in North Carolina, it was won by 2%, a state where Latinos make up 4% of all voters. So when we talk about what is going to happen, we know that the Latino vote will be absolutely decisive, and that any candidate will have to walk through the Latino community to get to the White House. That is how decisive we will be in this election. And whether it's in major states like Arizona and Nevada, other states like, again, Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, we will play a role in handing that victory to the candidate.
Thank you, Cindy. We can see the passion you have in reaching out for voters. I also went with Lenny Gonzalez to knock doors in 2016 on behalf of Hillary Clinton. It was a beautiful experience. Clarissa and all of you, I want to talk about a little bit about, and Cindy started to answer this, about Latinos are still the sleeping giant in elections, but Roberta has some questions also for you. There's some questions in the Q&A bottom. So Roberta, why don't you pitch us some of those questions, and we will continue. Go ahead, Roberta, please.
Well, before picking up the questions, now that Cindy mentioned she's going from here to Pennsylvania, I wanted to ask her precisely what importance does she give to the Puerto Rican community in Pennsylvania after the events of the past weekend?
Oh my goodness, Roberta. Well, I will tell you that first and foremost, one of the findings that we had in the poll that we launched, and I'm going to put it in the chat, is that 1/4 of Latino voters in Pennsylvania are Spanish dominant, which means that, like as campaigns are thinking of how do we reach the Latino community in Pennsylvania, that absolutely speaking and Spanish is a key factor. And then I would also say a lot of people don't know that outside of Puerto Rico and New York, Philadelphia has the largest Puerto Rican community in the country, and will be absolutely decisive, not only in Philadelphia, but Reading, Allentown, and even in other counties where we see a significant Puerto Rican community as well as Mexican community. And I will tell you, Roberta, that I was just there actually this week with the campaign with Maya Harris and our partner organization, Voto Latino, talking directly to the Puerto Rican community and making sure that we understand the moment that we're living in, right? It's a moment where we are seeing the vitriol, where we're seeing more and more the inhumane words that are being said about our beloved community. And I can tell you this, people are excited, and I cannot wait to see the outcome of this election, because I know from every single Puerto Rican that I have in my phone book, Roberta, that they are participating.
Thank you. Yes, Roberto, go ahead, and then we go to Clarissa.
So I just, on this point of the sleeping giant, a phrase I don't like to subscribe to, but something that the big underlying question here, and I'm sure that Clarissa and Cindy want to address it, is turnout. And the notable, consistent, unchanging fact about Latinos in American politics is the turnout has been consistently low and lower than for any other major racial and ethnic group. You can go back to the election of 2000. And since then, in every cycle where they've been vastly different elections, Obama's reelection, his first election, Trump and Clinton, Biden and Clinton, the gap between Latino turnout and that of non-Hispanic whites has steadily been about 20 points. It goes, the number of people who vote goes up and down depending on the election. The gap remains. In the last election, 2020, biggest turnout election in American history by far, barely 50% of eligible Latinos voted. Barely half of people who could vote voted. So even changing that phenomena a little bit could make an enormous difference because there's so many at stake. Complicating it is that there are so many new voters, something that Unidos has been tracking religiously for years now and showing how this electorate changes in every cycle with new voters. So it's not a sleeping giant. It's not the same giant it was 4 years ago. But the question of who bothers to show up and the self-disenfranchisement of Latino voters is really an extraordinary phenomenon for which I don't have any good answers. And I'll leave you just with one thought. Even if there's a big increase, you could still end up with 45%. I mean, if we go from 50% to 55%, which would be an enormous number of voters and a huge increase in turnout, you'd still have 45% of the Latino electorate sitting out the most consequential election in our lifetimes, potentially.
Larissa, I can tell that you want to say something about this. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, the devil's in the details, and it is important to disaggregate things, right? So first of all, we don't have 30 million plus Latinos eligible to vote. We don't. The reason I say that is because if 30 million Latinos who are citizens of voting age decided Wednesday that they wanted to vote, more than 13 million of them cannot because they are not registered. So
Yeah.
we have 30 million plus who are eligible to register. And the reason disaggregating that is essential is because if you're trying to diagnose the problem or the intervention that is needed, it looks quite different if you're talking about voter registration than turnout. In presidential elections, 8 of every 10 Latinos who are registered to vote. In 2020, that was 88% of Latinos who were registered voted. So what we have, so yes, you can look at the numbers and come up with the same number, but the point here is if we don't disaggregate that, then the intervention is completely wrong. And what we know from the American system of politics is that while we see billions of dollars and now $1 million raffles to move voters taking place, there is an infinitesimal amount of money or support that goes into voter registration. Now, when you look at the fact that the Latino community is a young community, we know that every year, on the average, about 1 million Latino US citizens are going to turn 18 and become eligible to register to vote. And that's part of why the voter opportunity gap, the voter registration opportunity gap, is growing at a faster clip then we can bend that curve, right? But the payoff is clear. If you're going to register 10 and 8 of those at least are going to vote, the payoff is clear, which is why it continues to be dumbfounding that there is so little investment. So yes, some folks may call the community a sleeping giant. I refute that for a number of different reasons. But it is also important to figure out, like, if you're injecting tranquilizers into the giant, does that make the giant sleepy, or is there something else going on, right? So anyway, like I said, folks are shocked when they hear those things. I saw a question talking about whether there is data on how Latino registration rates, turnout compared to other populations. Absolutely, the census puts that data out every year. And if you want to look at the data for the Latino voting age population, you can go to the Hispanic Electorate Data Hub link that I put in the chat.
So let me just clarify one point here, really. I'm talking about the larger phenomena of US citizens who are over 18, who have the ability to participate in elections and who choose not to. And what you're pointing to is, yes, if they register, they vote. But the larger question is why people don't even bother to register.
Right, and coming from the perspective of practitioners,
right?
You're
coming, well, so what is the intervention on the other parts of the electorate where people do register? You know, and in states that have made it very easy to register almost automatically, you're registered, for example, when you get a driver's license in some states. So I'm talking about the larger, you're talking about interventions and where money ought to go. I'm talking about the political phenomena of the fact that you start out with 30 plus million US citizens over 18, and you end up with 60 or 17 million people who actually vote. And yes, there's a difference between registering and then voting, but people don't even bother to register. So there is some larger political phenomena there about non-participation, and you can blame it on the philanthropies, or you can ask about the voting.
No, Roberto, but I also am not comfortable with simply blaming the actor, right? Which is sometimes what happens here. And there are studies about young Latinos who are of voting age. I don't disagree with the fact that there's a number of folks who don't think that politics is something that is worth their time. But the reality is that on studies that Unidos, they're not our studies, they're other folks' studies, whether folks like us who are more in the know about how these things work dismiss them or not, the reality is that for many Latinos, they say that they don't know how to go about it, or nobody has ever talked to them about it or invited them into the process. That may not be an invitation that we need, those of us in this virtual room. That may not be information that those of us here need, but that's what folks are saying.
Thank you,
Teresa. Rafael, can I jump in just for a second? I've been trying to hold myself still for a minute.
Because David also has been raising his hand, and we have to go to some of the questions. But go ahead, Cindy, and then we go to David, and then Roberta and I will read you some of the questions here. Yes, Cindy, please.
Absolutely, Rafael. Well, and there's a couple of points that I want to make. First and foremost, like many of us that are in this room, as Clarissa pointed out, I want to say are privileged, right? Like we work day in and day out. We understand what voter registration is. We know how to participate. We know where to go to look for this information. We know where to look to see if we're registered. A lot of people simply do not understand how the system works. And let me just be very, very clear. Intentionally in the US, the classes of civic classes have been taken out of the K through 12 curriculum. These classes no longer exist in our public education system, which means that, yes, our Latinos who are turning 18 do not understand how our system works. And this is a very strategic, systemic way of keeping our Latino community suppressed. It's not understanding and being aware of how the system works. And then I would say two more things. One is the massive disinformation that we have seen for the last two presidential cycles, specifically targeting the Latino community, whereas the overall message is that their vote does not matter. And really in this election, what we're seeing is threatening them, as we have seen with the Article 3 YouTube videos that have been placed, by the way, in all of the battleground states. And so this is something that we do follow in terms of how the Latino community is intimidated through disinformation. And lastly, I would just point out, Rafael, that in America, voter suppression is real. And, you know, just this week, we saw the US Supreme Court allow Virginia to proceed with a last minute change. This just happened this week, days before the election, of purging eligible voters, a move that was ordered by Republican Governor Youngkin this year. And this basically allows the removal of approximately 1,600 Virginians from the voter rolls. Again, what we're seeing, Rafael, is massive disinformation as well as voter suppression in very real ways, days before the election, in states where really that margin will come to small numbers. And we're going to see this across the board, not only in this election cycle, but also in future ones.
Thank you, Cindy. David, what is your take on this? And we have so many questions that we will start reading it to you. Go ahead, David, please.
Yeah, my take on, as Roberto was talking about the bigger phenomenon, the bigger picture, well, certainly in terms of all of the research and studies of this, nothing has yet overcome in general and in a big picture the age-old factors in terms of being correlated with voting, with civic participation, of age, income, and educational attainment. And in fact, if you control for those factors, there have been studies that have done that. Not only, as Clarissa was saying, Latinos who register are obviously much more likely to vote or able to vote, and do so at a comparable level of other registered voters. But if you control for those three, Latinos are younger than the U.S. average, and have a lower level of income, and have, on average, a lower level of educational attainment. You find if you control for those, there's no difference at all between Latino voters and non-Latino voters. The other thing, though, I would like to just very quickly touch on this question of, you know, are Latinos still, or could they ever be characterized as a sleeping giant? It's not just, of course, and I agree with those who say they don't like that choice of language. But even, like, say, for example, in the most current instance of Pennsylvania and the insult to the Puerto Rican community that happened at the Trump, you could call it a hate fest in New York City at Madison Square Garden. There are Puerto Rican leaders in Pennsylvania who have said, this woke us up, right? And when you look at lots of prominent people who have immediately responded to that insult, to that very severe insult, I can see why some people would use that sort of language, right? That it sort of shakes some people out of their complacency. More specifically, it is a cause, it is a focal point for mobilization. And we've seen this over and over again, and I think that's what lies behind your question about sleeping giant. Of course, in 1994 in California with Proposition 187 and the Pete Wilson reelection campaign, we also saw it in Arizona. It lasted for about 10 years between their law, the Bill 1070, and in 2020, when Arizona was flipped very strategically, and it's really important in this coming election again. We also saw it in Nevada in the senatorial race in 2010, in which similar sorts of maligning of Latinos on the issue of immigration was used. And at that time, Senator Harry Reid made what I still consider the biggest bet in all American political history on the Latino vote, and was able to win in that election. So there are moments, there are things that can shake things up. What we don't know right now, I think it's very clear that what happened at Madison Square Garden at that Trump rally has shaken things up and could make the difference in Pennsylvania. There's no doubt about that. And I would also, in terms of will Latinos make the difference, it's going to come, I think it's going to come down to those questions. Pennsylvania and the Puerto Rican vote in Pennsylvania and its mobilization, which is going on right now, and Nevada and Arizona, where Latinos have played a very important role in recent elections.
Thank you, David. We have lots of questions. Let me read two. Carmen Flores is asking why Latino young males are so appealed by Trump. Why is that they like Trump a lot? And Kate Broom from UC Santa Barbara is asking us, what is the economic factor and Latinos going for Trump? Roberta, you have any other question?
No, but I want to take the opportunity that we have to differentiate the cultural and the economic factors. And certainly the first question by Carmen goes into the idea of if for cultural reasons, Latinos identify or like Trump or this macho style for young men. And I would add to that, now that it has been mentioned by many of the participants, whether the Latinos have the cultural desire to vote. Many come from countries where voting was not available or did not make a difference. So once they reach the United States, there is not that culture of the importance of participation.
Okay, Clarissa, let's go to you. What is your take on these things? What else you want to share with us?
So I think that I hear a lot about, Latinos don't have a culture of participation because of where they came from. Let's remember that 8 in 10 Latinos in the United States are United States citizens. Now, not all of them were born here, but the notion that is because Latinos came from somewhere else holds less and less as we continue on this track, because of those under 18, 9 in 10 are US citizens, right? So Latino growth is now being driven by births for some time, not for immigration. Look, the economy is the biggest thing. And the reality is that for most voters, their markers are the markers. How am I doing? Who's in charge? Some folks may understand, that those dynamics were put in place 4 years ago. This person is reaping the results of what's happened, et cetera, et cetera. For many voters is who's in charge and how am I doing? And the reality is that Latinos were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, not only health-wise, but economically. And as they were trying to recover from that, they got hit by inflation at the same time that some of the supports that were put in place to deal with the pandemic started going away, right? And while the economy is doing well, for the majority of Latinos who are part of the working class, that is not felt the way that it is for higher educated or higher income Latinos. Your biggest outputs in terms of money that's coming in and that is going out are going to be rent, right? Or a mortgage and the daily things that you have. And so those are the things that people are looking at. I would say that Latino voters have been crucial in putting housing on the national presidential debate stage, because this has been a top issue for Latinos for more than a year. And so they were the early canaries in the mine in terms of forcing candidates to actually put proposals on the table on how they're going to deal with this issue.
Thank you, Clarissa. We'll go to you, Roberto. But there's another question that I believe is very important. Raul Rodriguez is asking where Latinos stand on immigration issues, because it's let's face it, this is the attack line of Trump, and he's been saying so awful things about immigrants. And so where do Latinos stand on immigration, and why are Latinos apparently not punishing Trump for what he's saying? Roberto, David, and Sydney, and we have only 15 minutes to go, so let's move ahead because there's too many questions out there.
Right, so Carlos Olio, a great analyst at Equis Research, has a hypothesis which I tend to buy into, which is that what we're seeing in terms of immigration this year is Latino voters distinguishing between the long-standing population of unauthorized who are in this country, who've been here for a long time, who have U.S. citizen children, who are well established, and the newcomers from the displacement migrations of the last few years, and particularly the last 2 or 3 or 4 years. and that they're drawing a distinction in their minds between the two in terms of their political attitudes. And so what you see in the polls is a kind of ambiguity or ambivalence in which you have very strong support for legalization, which has been there forever. And at the same time, somewhat more support for tough enforcement than we've seen in recent years among Hispanic voters, including more support for border controls and even more support for deportation. Beyond that, the other really interesting phenomena that I see on this question is the number of Latino candidates, particularly in a number of congressional seats. I mean, I just underscore this as a separate subject in a minute, who are using, I have, excuse me, a collection of congressional ads by Latino candidates that feature sheriffs and other law enforcement officials, or they claim to be tough on the border. Mario Gallego in Arizona, the Senate race, really crucial, is running on I'll bring safety to the border. I mean, Kamala Harris is campaigning on I will regain control of the border. The Democratic Party as a whole has shifted towards enforcement. I mean, her great promise is that on day one, she'll produce a bill that is enforcement only, which was anathema to immigration advocates and to Latino advocates just a year ago. So there's been a general shift in politics here that you see where Latinos are moving with the rest of the country, and certainly with the candidates on this issue, where the American public has responded to events on the border with a very decisive desire for more enforcement. How that enforcement is carried out, there are worlds of difference. I'm not equating what Trump is saying and what Harris is saying, what these Democratic candidates are saying. I'm just saying that in general, the message of safety, which is the way Gallego, for example, puts it, and a lot of other Latino congressional candidates put it, has shifted the rhetoric around immigration. And in the polls, you see Latino candidates respond to that. Briefly, I'm going to throw out one other topic, which the question of whether what Latinos are going to do at the presidential race is important, but maybe more important and sleeping here is that there are a good 6 to 10, maybe a dozen congressional seats, depending on how you look at the polls, that are totally up for grabs, and they are in districts with very large Latino populations all over the place. And in states like New York and California, each one of them have 3 or 4 congressional seats in places where there's no big presidential campaign happening. There's swing seats in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, where all those Puerto Ricans vote in Pennsylvania. There's a swing congressional seat. There's one in Arizona. There's one in Nevada. There's one in Colorado. There's one in Oregon. There are a lot of interesting congressional races where Latinos could determine the balance of power in Washington in terms of who controls the House in a very direct way and much more immediately than you'll see in the presidential contest, which is going to be so narrow, because many of these districts, they're in very heavily, 20% plus Latino electorates, and with Latino candidates on both parties. So I would encourage listeners and journalists out there to pay attention to those congressional races next week, because it's going to be a very interesting way of understanding what the Latino effect is going to be overall on the balance of power.
Thank you, Roberto. Roberta, we have 10 more minutes to go. So why, if it's fine with you, we'll give around a 2-minute time to each one of our panelists and ask them, what are the key things that we should be looking at the Latino vote? What about Latino women? And what are the key issues that will move them to vote this coming Tuesday? And whatever you want to be your concluding remarks. Roberta, what else should we ask to our panelists? So we will give them the last opportunity
Yes.
to share their thoughts and passion with us.
I love to ask them if they think Latino voters, and especially Latino women that you just mentioned, see Harris as a Latino woman.
Okay, so why don't we start with you, David Ayon? We'll go to Sydney, Roberto, and we finish with Clarissa. David?
It's an interesting point, certainly not as a Latina. What she is in our language is she's a mestiza. She is biracial in terms of her South Indian and Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean ancestry in terms of her parents. In fact, I knew her father at Stanford. That question is an interesting one because it was said very famously, even notoriously, by a pollster I think all of us knew when he was alive, that Latinos would not vote for Obama because he's Black, right? And that turned out not to be the case. And I do think that that at least some proportion of Latino voters actually saw something in Obama, himself being biracial, as being significant to them in some way. And I think clearly showed in Latin America with the way he was received at the summits of the Americas. He was seen, and it was even heads of state said, I forget who it was that was in power in Panama, said, he looks like a Panameño, right? So they did embrace him in that sense. But there's this other thing that has to be combated, and this has really been put on display, I think, with the incident, with the insult to the Puerto Rican community, and the efforts being made to mobilize the Puerto Rican community, in particular in Pennsylvania, is that there has been for a long, long time a sub rosa sort of not visible but present strategy on the Republican side to make African American voters think that the Democratic Party favors immigrants, and in particular illegals, more than you, right? And on the Latino side, for a long time, and I've seen this myself personally, trying to convince Latinos, and we're talking about even in that community, Latino Republicans, African American Republicans, Latino Republicans trying to persuade Latino voters that the Democratic Party is beholden to the African American community and doesn't care about Latinos. And there are things that they can use to try to make that point. Like, for example, the Democrats nominated an African American presidential candidate who won and became president, and now again we have an African American candidate in Kamala Harris. So that has tended to work. I'm really interested in seeing how far does the insult to the Puerto Rican community break through? Do other Latinos as well feel themselves? Do they understand it, right? That in fact, the antipathy that we see from the Republican Party, and in particular from the Trump movement, isn't really about whether you're legal or illegal. We can see that in the case of they're targeting the Haitians, who are legally protected, nevertheless became targets. Isn't even about even being an immigrant, because Puerto Ricans aren't immigrants. They're US citizens by birth. There really is at bottom an antipathy to Latinos and to diversity and to a multi-racial, multi-ethnic democracy on the right. And it's a question of how many people are going to perceive that. I think clearly where it's really happening is in the Puerto Rican community, most of all in Pennsylvania.
Thank you, David. Cindy, your 1 minute of concluding remarks.
So
And thanks a lot for being with us.
And as I go into the concluded, I did want to point out that Republican aligned campaigns have spent $681 million on nearly over 1,600 unique TV ads that mention immigration so far this year. Historical, $681 million on TV ads that specifically air and mention immigration this year. And so this is a historical number. This is why we're seeing the issue of immigration, again, be a political wedge issue. We knew that Republicans had a chance to actually get this over the finish line, but unfortunately, because immigration is a political issue in America, they would not pass it in Congress. And we saw that happen very recently when we asked for Republicans to support a bill that Biden had proposed. And so I just want to put that out there, Rafael, that the issue of immigration is used as a political piñata. It happens every 4 years. You know, like we already recognize it. We know it's coming. And again, it was used this year. And as I transition to my concluding remarks, I would say that the Latino vote is powerful. And when we turn out, we shape elections, we influence policies, and we ensure that the issues that matter most to us are prioritized. For us, it's really the bread and butter issues, as Clarissa mentioned. It's about housing, it's about our jobs, the salaries that we're earning, the food that we're buying, and the inflation that we're seeing, and you know, eggs going from costing $3 to over like $6, and how that just impacts the daily lives of people, including the price of gasoline. Believe it or not, that all of that influences our voters. But what I would say, especially as our Latino community continues to grow, is that there is a reason why we're seeing voter suppression. There is a reason why there's a strategy to try to keep Latinos from being able to access the ballot box. And it's because Republicans understand the power that we have. Maybe some in our community, to your point, Roberto, still don't get it. But for the most part, when we see the numbers, right, and eligible Latinos, over 36 million, which will continue to grow in the next 10 years, Republicans have seen this for the last few years, which is why we've seen state by state voter suppression happening as well as national. And so I think as we look towards the future, Rafael, it's also looking at how we shift our Latino community from simply being eligible to actually registering and again to turning out to vote. And for the media who is on, I would say follow the money, right? Clarissa hit it on the nail. We know that there's massive divestment and disinvestment that is happening. It's not coming to the Latino community, which means what we do is really done with a nickel and dime to try to get our community to register to vote and to turn out to vote. And lastly, if you don't take anything away, is that we are not a monolith and that we are persuasion voters. And as we look at the trends of Latino voters, what you also have to look at is not only Democrats and Republicans, but also how many Latinos are now shifting to be unaffiliated voters. Thank you.
Roberto.
I very briefly, one parting thought, which is when you look at a great many of the trends among Latino voters, what you see is they are being shaped by trends that are happening nationwide. And one error, I think, in analysis and the way we think about this is to somehow see Latinos as a world apart in some kind of a bubble that they exist under themselves. When in fact, in terms of political behavior, what's happening with Latino men, what's happening with Latino women, with Latino evangelicals in Florida, in Pennsylvania, in the Rio Grande Valley, whether it's a part of the population or a geography, increasingly, I think we see the trends that are shaping the rest of the country are very much shaping the Latino electorate, and understanding the interplay there is sort of the key to analyzing this vote.
Thank you, Roberto. We'll finish with you, Clarissa, and then I will give the floor to Roberto to close.
Yeah, the thing that I would leave folks with is this: challenge your assumptions. I've seen all kinds of incredible statements and headlines about Hispanic voters, and when you look under the hood, you see that it's a poll of 300 people that is being used to say Latinos now think the earth is not round. So check your data. and particularly when we're seeing those kinds of statements. For me, I want to be in an environment where both parties are competing hard for the vote of this community. We're going to have to figure out how to fight mis and disinformation, because the ideal is that we have a clean fight where people are actually competing for the support of these voters based on what they're proposing to respond to the priorities and the aspirations of this community. I know that everybody has heard a lot about the fact of the Latino vote. The Latino community is not a monolith, which is a laughable statement for anybody who is Latino. But here's what I would say: we've never been. The notable thing is that though we are not a monolith, there's a great deal of affinity on the top priorities and on the top solutions we want to see. And that holds across age, gender, and states. There are significant variances, as there are with every population. I think that the caution is that a lot of those variances, because lo que va contra la corriente es lo que tiene más interés, sometimes the variances are used to try to characterize this electorate as a whole. Bottom line, the data shows, the anecdotal, qualitative, and hard data shows that Latinos tend to reject extremes in taking rights away from others. So the more that we work to close that voter registration opportunity gap and bring people to the voting booth, I think it's not just going to be good for the Latino community. I think it's going to be good for the polarized nature of our political discourse that we're experiencing now for several elections.
Thank you. Roberta?
Well, I just want to thank, first of all, you, Rafael, for organizing this, and the panelists, Cindy, Clarissa, David, Roberto, for this extraordinary presentation. Because for us in Mexico, and speaking on behalf of Sergio Alcocer, our president, it's very important to learn more and to understand the role of the Latino community in the upcoming election and in the future. This has been fantastic, and I thank you all for your great information and the presentation itself.
Thank you, Roberta, and thank you, David, thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Cindy and Clarissa. Cindy and Clarissa, you're my champions. I thank you for what you're doing out there, not only for I mean, I would say not only for Latinos, but for the US. I mean, yes, with champions like you, with women like you, I believe this country will improve. Thank you. Un abrazo. Gracias.
Igualmente, gracias a todos.
Gracias. Buen día.
Nos vemos.
Abrazos.